Okay, so we'll pivot now to the first panel of the afternoon titled Hidden Abuses. So, kind of a uses, abuses panel. And we'll have one panel with four participants and then another following that with three. So, this panel features Rimona Afana, Jap Lampkin, Paulina Shimienitz, and Nathan Poirier. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of your names, but I hope they're only minor ones. Um, and so, yeah, we'll just start right away. And just to let you all know, for the panels, we do use the Q&A box quite a bit. So anytime you have a question for the speakers, put it in the Q&A, and then I will send them over at the end of the three talks. So our first talk today features two speakers, Rimona Afana and Jack Adam Lampkin, and it's titled Cosmic Captivity and Animal Ethics, Exploring the Suffering of Animals Used in Outer Space Research. Rimona Afana is a Romanian-Palestinian researcher, lecturer, activist, and multimedia artist. Her research on mass atrocities against humans and non-humans is published in leading law and criminology journals and books, and her artwork appears in literature journals, arts magazines, festivals, and exhibitions. Over the past 20 years, she has also contributed to many civic projects on human and non-human rights in different countries. Jack Adam Lampkin is a senior lecturer in criminology at York St. John University, where he is also the postgraduate programs lead for social science. His research interests are in green criminology, and he has recently worked on expanding conceptions of environmental harm into outer space, considering the environmental impact of space industries. Thank you both for being here, and I will shift it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Jack Lampkin. I'm going to go first out of myself and Ramona. I was intending to show some slides, but my uh, technological abilities are failing me, so I'm just going to do my best. So I apologise to Ramona. We were going to have some pictures to show you. Ramona, I'm hoping might be able to show you a few anyway later on. But my job to start with, essentially, is to try and give you a quick overview, essentially, of the historic use and abuse of animals in spaceflight research. And then Ramona is going to add some more to that afterwards. So I'll do the best I can in the time I have in the next 10 minutes or so. So really, it started in a kind of following the atrocities of the Second World War, the space flight research, so being able to send rockets into outer space, the development of that technology, it did start before the Second World War, but it kind of really got going after the Second World War. And the main kind of purpose of that was this kind of technological rivalry between East and West, between the US on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. One of the big ideas, I guess, around that time was to try and become a kind of powerful technological leader in the aftermath of the Second World War. And one thing that both the US and the Soviet Union were kind of trying to do in the Cold War era, essentially, was to do things first in space. So there was this rivalry to be the first to get to space, to start with using rocket technology. And there was then the first to send a human into outer space. There was also then the first to get to the moon, land on the moon, or all those kinds of things. Now, quite often in the kind of historical narrative of that time period, it's figures like Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union or John Glenn of the US who are kind of celebrated as these heroes of spaceflight research, being the first people to go to outer space, to reach outer space. But actually, to get to that point, it required the death and abuse, essentially, of many, many animals who were tested in spaceflight technology before humans then were kind of brave enough as a result of that to go to outer space themselves. So that's a kind of very whistle-stop tour background, this technological rivalry fueled rocket technology development post-World War II. The Second World War was actually really important in developing that the kind of long-range missile technology, unfortunately, which then wreaked havoc across Europe during the Second World War. But that kind of the technological development continued after the Second World War. But animals were massively important in the US. Um, they used lots of different animals, but one of the main animals they used was chimps, monkeys essentially, and in the Soviet Union they used dogs. So a very different kind of mix. So it's a bit more complicated than that, but just as a general theme, there was a kind of difference there in terms of the animals that were used, and that can even reflect, kind of cultural kind of reflections of the time as well. In terms of the Soviets being really kind of loving of that particular species, even though they kind of went on to use and abuse it. And then I think monkeys were used by the US to um, uh, kind of resemble a kind of close relation to humans as being a kind of natural uh, animal to use in the spaceflight process. Um, I really wanted to show a slide that has this big long list of different animals that were used in different ways by those two countries from the outset. The actual first animal to reach out space was fruit flies, a little box of 200 fruit flies, which were sent into outer space, returned, and then they kind of opened the box and they were all still alive. The idea was that they wanted to use animals to test for things like the impact on biological organisms for atmospheric pressure, G-forces, weightlessness, those kinds of things before then humans went and got in rockets themselves to venture into outer space. Now, a difficulty that I have been grappling with, and I'm sure we'll all have your own ideas about this in the room, is this paradox between we have kind of modern day technology has been kind of particularly those things that we use outer space for on a regular basis in terms of satellites to do things like what we're doing today. Um, the kind of background of that was a lot of kind of technological process, but also the use and abuse of animals at that time. But we can use things like satellites, for instance, now for environmental monitoring, for weather forecasting, for loads of really good purposes in terms of environmental protection, in terms of looking at or predicting areas of drought and flooding and climate change and those kinds of things. The paradox is that we also use satellites for things like communications, for social media, for maybe things that aren't quite as necessary as monitoring climate change, for instance. So actually, that there's a paradox between whether we should be kind of, I guess, using those technologies, even though there's this kind of history of harm and use and abuse of animals. Myself and Ramona, we've been working on this kind of work, the kind of thinking about animals in outer space research and development for probably the last kind of 2 years now, and we've tried to theorize around why it's happened in a number of ways. A couple of the things that I wanted to kind of throw out there today was the theory of sacrifice. So actually, these animals, particularly in that Cold War era, from kind of the late 1940s, kind of through to the early 1960s, where spaceflight technology was kind of uh, much more advanced. We have this animals seem to have been kind of sacrificed for those purposes, but actually celebrated as well by the public in the US and in the Soviet Union around that time. So it wasn't maybe they were maybe kind of unaware as to the background of the harm that actually developing those technologies was causing those animals. But they were celebrated. A lot of the animals involved in those processes were celebrated, and their kind of sacrifice was heralded as kind of the price for technological progress at that time, which was really important in that Second World War era. We've also thought about things like utilitarianism, principle of utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. It kind of ties in with that theory of sacrifices to the extent to which, particularly in that Cold War era, animals were sacrificed for that price of progress. Animals are still used in outer space research. There are animals still on the International Space Station, for instance, at the moment. They're used for testing purposes, for the development of medicines and things like that. So the kind of use of animals has changed from kind of testing spaceflight to now trying to do some, I guess, different things in terms of testing. What we think about that, I think in this room we would still have massive reservations about that. But it's interesting in and of itself that the kind of rationale or for using animals has changed to kind of more testing now than it was in spaceflight research history. So what I wanted to do in this first part was just to paint the picture, set the scene for you, just to tell or remind people that animals played a major part in the development of us being able to do anything in space. Say us as humans being able to do anything in space. Without animals, we wouldn't have been able to do any of those things. So their contribution is quite often, say, theirs in animal, or the non-human contribution is often ignored when we think about progress anyway. Even that sacrifice isn't recognised, and they actually endured some kind of terrible conditions in those processes, which I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of Rimona to explain a little bit more in that area.
Does everybody hear me well? Good. So thank you, Jonathan, and everyone for having me. I will start with a self-disparaging disclaimer. This is my first encounter with space-related issues, so my grasp of the area is rudimentary. My thoughts on animals in space draw primarily on my research about human and non-human captivity over the past years. Um, so it focused in much scholarship and activism on atrocities against humans and non-humans is often the brutal end, how people and animals were unjustly killed, the colossal number of victims, and so on. But before the end, captivity, whether literal or figurative, is often part of the picture. Whether it's atrocities against humans amid genocide like Gaza, during war, during misleading peace, or the everyday horrors of criminal sectors like industrial animal farming or wildlife trade. I believe that a focus on captivity unveils the complexity of physical and psychological suffering preceding the end. So death is not truly the problem. We all die, and once we're dead, the analysis turns redundant. What concerns me are the horrors preceding death, the protracted suffering, and that comes in many forms. So for animals, captivity facilitates extraction, the extraction of body parts or forced labor, and it's typically the precursor of killing. So, in a sense, for me, captivity is the matrix within which extraction, torture, and murder are taking place. That's, of course, also the case with animal experimentation in outer space. So captivity is foundational to all abuses accompanying it. So, without understanding and challenging confinement, animal use and abuse remain normalized. Some very quick background first. Trillions of non-human animals live and die in captivity across sectors like food, clothing, medicine, entertainment, and so on. The torture and murder of animals rely on their confinement. And today's scale and intensity of animal abuse across multiple commercial sectors would be impossible without confinement. Animals, of course, don't joyfully consent to being exploited, so confinement facilitates abuse. Captivity covers a variety of limitations to a being's capacity to move freely. It can involve confinement in a tight space, blocking the subject's ability to get out. It can involve physical restraint or immobilization and other practices obstructing a being's liberty, autonomy, and bodily integrity. Captivity is often aggravated by immobilization, by restraint, and/or solitary confinement. And animals abused in outer space research have often experienced these additional layers of harm. They found themselves confined, immobilized, or restrained during experiments and confined alone sometimes. Of course, animals with complex sentience suffer physically and psychologically from captivity. Their need for freedom, autonomy, bodily integrity collides with our so-called right to abuse them. I see captivity as a form of torture as violence, and it often occurs in tandem with other forms of torture, crushing the body and spirit of victims. The physical and psychological impact of captivity on both humans and non-human animals is documented by hundreds of studies. Captive animals develop a variety of muscular, skeletal, cardiovascular, neurologic, immune conditions because of the lack of movement and also because of the chronic stress of being trapped. Infections are also common from immune suppression, which is a result of chronic stress and from the overcrowded unsanitary conditions often enforced for profit maximization. Captivity also causes or exacerbates mental illness. So, for instance, anxiety, stress, depression, PTSD, complex PTSD, and other conditions are common among captive animals. Significantly, trillions of animals routinely abused across different commercial sectors are animals with complex sentience. So this matters because we have a lot of research to understand that the animals we use and abuse do suffer immensely, and that's also the case with numerous animals used in outer space research. For instance, monkeys, dogs, cats. We know enough about their needs and abilities and how the privation of those needs impact them. I will skip a bit forward since I'm running out of time, but I will just generally share that over decades, a lot of animals have been involved in outer space research. Non-human primates, rodents, cats, dogs, tortoises, frogs, insects like moths, ants, fruit flies, and other animals have played a part in technological advancement, space exploration, and expansionism. Their sacrifice is often presented as inevitable collateral damage, serving scientific progress, but this, of course, sanitizes the cruel realities of experimentation. Animals experience captivity, immobilization, electric shocks, mutilation, for instance, electrodes, sensors, and other equipment inserted in their bodies. So death did not come easily for most. It was preceded by months or years of torturous violence. For instance, in a NASA article from 1998, we learned that without animal testing, the Soviet and American space programs would have suffered great losses of human life. Quote, these animals performed a service to their respective countries that no human could or would have performed. They gave their lives in the name of technological advancement, paving the way for humanity's many forays into space. This framing, of course, sanitizes the killing of sentient beings. So, unlike human astronauts, non-humans' service and sacrifice are not deliberate. For humans, space exploration comes with consent and rights. Humans engage in space research informed, willingly, enjoy protections physically, psychologically, enjoy material benefits. Animals are forced into it, have no awareness of the purpose and trajectory of the activities involved, and their body and spirit are violated. Significant to note here is that animal experimentation in outer space is in some ways different from other types of animal testing, but in most other ways similar. So overall, the core ethical issues are similar because besides the particulars in outer space like microgravity and radiation, just like in medical experiments, animals are trapped in tight, artificial, monotonous spaces. And that's often aggravated by solitary confinement or overcrowding or forced cohabitation with conspecifics and so on. They are subjected to invasive procedures. So there are many similarities. Multiple aggravating factors are layered on top of captivity, as mentioned earlier. One of them is restraint. To facilitate these stressful procedures, confined animals are often immobilized. This is common not just in outer space research, it's also routine in medical experiments, factory farming, and so on. Another factor aggravating captivity is isolation. Many animals are held in solitary confinement for days, months, or years. It's especially problematic when it comes to social animals. Also, studies show that barren and confined environments amplify pain. the likelihood, duration, and perceived intensity of pain are modulated by the animals' control over environmental conditions, physical activity, exploratory behavior, social opportunities, and other factors that animals in captivity have no or little autonomy over. Today, of course, significantly less animals are used in outer space research given the changing realities of space exploration. Also, we supposedly have enhanced protections for animals used in research generally. However, a chasm still lingers between the cruel realities of experimentation and the lofty so-called ethical principles. The animal sacrifice for science typically remain a mere footnote in the history books. And that's why we felt we need to know and share their story. And I will share a few words on three prematurely cut lives. I will be trying to share my screen.
I have the images as well if it doesn't work for you.
Yeah, just a second to see if it works. Do you all see the image now?
1 second, I think it's loading. Yes, we do.
So you are seeing here Enos strapped to equipment ahead of his insertion in the Mercury Atlas V capsule. Enos became the first and only chimpanzee to orbit Earth in 1961. His mission was part of tests for a human orbital flight conducted by John Glenn in 1962. And although Enos survived his flight, he endured captivity, immobilization, experienced multiple electric shocks, and had sensors and other equipment strapped to or inserted in his body. Enos died of dysentery 11 months after his flight. I will now share another image. Just a second. Do you all see the next photo?
Not yet.
Second. Now?
It's coming. Yes.
So here you have Felicet, designed the C-341 before the flight and Felix after the flight. The first feline launched into space in 1963, part of the French space program. Felicet was, of course, also routinely confined and immobilized, had electrodes implanted in her skull to monitor her neurological activity. During the flight, had electrical impulses applied to the brain. And although she survived the flight, she was killed 2 months later for scientists to examine her brain. And the very last image. Is it loading?
It's visible. Yeah, it was visible.
Sorry. Now?
Yes, we see it.
So, of course, we conclude with Soviet space pioneer Laika, sent into space in 1957, the first animal to orbit Earth. She was picked up from the streets as a stray puppy in Moscow, and she was deemed suitable for experimentation because of her supposed gentle temperament. In fact, it was probably that homelessness. So, of course, homeless animals are used to hunger, they're used to pain, used to fear, to extreme heat or cold. And that perhaps made her a good candidate for experiencing similar conditions during research. So deprivation and obedience are needed for proper exploitation, and no consent is necessary for such one-way journeys. Laika died of overheating and stress just 5 hours into the flight. She was killed through systems breakdown due to the failure of the capsule's thermal control system. That's it. Thank you.